Welcome, everyone. I'm Ahilan Arulanandam, Faculty Co-Director of the Center for Immigration Law and Policy, and you have joined Day 3 of Immigration Policy in the Biden administration, the first 100 days and beyond. I'm here with my colleague and mentor, Professor Hiroshi Motomura, who is as brilliant and knowledgeable an immigration law scholar as you will find, and also a truly kind human being, and sometimes really funny, too. Before we continue, I want to acknowledge that UCLA Law School sits on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. For decades, people have said that this country is a nation of immigrants. And at some level, obviously they mean well by that statement. But of course, it also obscures a history of genocide that is too often ignored. I'm glad we're acknowledging that history, at least in this small way, and hopefully we'll do more than that in the time to come. We've been very fortunate to work with a superb team to put on this conference, and particularly today's events. So I want to thank Haley Burgess, Lynn Tremonti, Shada Jalali, Laura Elbaum, Wei-Joan Udden, Chris Newman, Christopher Roberts, and Ashley Dominguez for their tireless work. In honor of their superb work, I have worn UCLA colors today, blue and gold, for the last day of the conference. For the next 20 minutes or so, while you're getting your morning coffee or your afternoon coffee, or maybe your nighttime coffee if you're joining us from far away, Hiroshi and I will recap some highlights of Day 2, which occurred last Friday, and preview the fascinating day we have coming up here. So Day 2 opened with a panel on movement lawyering, which honestly I think should be required viewing for anyone involved in impact litigation, whether as a lawyer, an organizer, or someone in between. It was far too rich a discussion to summarize, but I will pull out some threads that I found particularly interesting. Two ideas that Jacinta Gonzalez first articulated seem to surface again and again. One, the tension between what is best for each person and what is best for collective liberation. And that's something that all the relevant actors have to constantly have in mind as we go about the work of advocacy in this context. Another was the way lawyers often let their views about what is politically possible influence the legal advice they give their clients, though sometimes they may have no particular special expertise on what is politically possible. Amaha Casa deepened the discussion by asking us to think about the difference between representing individual plaintiffs, representing classes, and representing organizations. And then also about the differences between the different types of organizations, those that have a membership base, those that do not, but try to operate under some kind of democratic decision-making process, and those that do neither one. He also surfaced some of the important costs associated with what is sometimes described as plaintiff work, the significant time and emotional labor that can go into that crucial aspect of impact litigation and supportive movements is something that all the actors also must take into account. Munir Ahmed brought the perspective of an attorney who has defended DACA for more than 4 years at this point and is now class counsel representing everyone who has or is eligible for DACA, which I'm sure is a tremendous weight at some level. I found his historical perspective so useful. He noted that the concerns of the so-called Dream movement are fundamentally different from what they were a decade ago, in significant part because immigrants' rights advocates have shaped its normative vision from both inside and outside of it. He also had a tip for law professors to teach more of what he called the normative piece of legal analysis, i.e., is the result in this case just? And that's something I will take to heart as I embark on my own teaching career. He also offered what felt like the most hopeful sentiment of the panel, and maybe the whole conference. He said, DACA seemed completely impossible right up until it was the most obvious thing in the world. And those are words for all of us to live by in the years to come. The lunch hour was very interesting for me. It involved my conversation with the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas. Hiroshi is going to summarize that rather than having me summarize my own conversation. I will say one thing about it, though. Over the weekend, the Secretary wrote offering to follow up on several items that we discussed during that meeting. And actually, I've spent much of this past week working to put together those follow-up discussions with his staff and other people working in immigrants' rights in various contexts. Obviously, we don't know yet whether anything will come of those, but to me, his commitment to a sincere dialogue has been remarkable. Our afternoon panel, I'll skip ahead to then, that was on the future of asylum. One of our goals here at the center is to bring together people working most directly on the ground on immigration issues with academics who have studied and theorized on these same issues at a high level for generative conversations between them. And for me, this panel was a perfect illustration of that mix. Again, I can only highlight rather than summarize. It began with a searing critique of Secretary Mayorkas's account of the Title 42 expulsion policy by Erica Pinheiro, who was zooming in from Tijuana, where she directs the legal and policy work of Al Otro Lado. As someone involved in the day-to-day representation of asylum seekers, she found it quite implausible that the Title 42 expulsion program was being implemented in order to mitigate coronavirus. Not only because various public health experts have said that that's not true, that the program is not necessary to serve that purpose, but also because, as she pointed out, her clients continue to end up in these things called lateral flights that DHS continues to conduct that put people in very close quarters for long periods of time before expelling them. Neither she nor I think any of our other panelists believed that the policy was designed to prevent the spread of coronavirus. Later, Erica would resist a question about visioning a better future, a question that I had wanted all the panelists to be asked, saying that she sees her work as simply trying to maintain the status quo to prevent immeasurable harm, human suffering in the border region from getting even worse, and resisting the demonization of migrants that, in her view, has already led us to a brush with fascism. That was a dark sentiment. Our other two panelists were not a lot more optimistic. Geraldine Joseph from the Haitian Bridge Alliance spoke powerfully about the complexity of the human phenomena that motivates migration, both in general and particularly in the present moment. She also talked about the acute racism that Black migrants have faced in different parts of Latin America, including in Mexico and Chile. And she too ended with a plea for basic humanitarian protections, including TPS for people from Haiti, among other countries. Professor Jairamji Nogales highlighted the limits of asylum law itself. Among other flaws, she noted its cramped nexus requirement, which protects only people who fled persecution on account of one of these 5 discrete grounds, and also its failure to recognize the need for safe transit, which means the law doesn't protect you until you touch US soil, and so the government can actively prevent you from doing that, as it has through these interdiction programs that effectively extend the southern border south. She also pushed us then to think about other models like the Cartagena Declaration and Mercosur in South America that afford broader protection than our asylum laws currently do. It became clear to me as the panel progressed that all of our panelists believe that people should be allowed to move freely for whatever reasons they wish, which would obviously render the whole asylum framework largely unnecessary. I'm not sure I agree with that, but it was striking to hear our moderator, Professor Tendai Achiume, who has written extensively on the subject, point out that the people who oppose free movement tend to be those who already enjoy it. That reminds me of something else I should mention, both with respect to those past panels and also the ones for today. You know, the moderators for the panels last Friday, Professor Samir Asher and Tendai Achiume, were extremely knowledgeable, even groundbreaking experts in their fields. And that was in keeping with our approach throughout the conference. We had preferred for the discussions to be led by people immersed in the subject matter of the panels, whether as academics, practitioners, or both. And you'll see the same is true of today's moderators. We're very grateful to all of the moderators of our panels for the contributions that they've made to this conference. Before I pass back to Hiroshi, I want to mention a couple of things for folks to watch for upcoming at the center. We will be sending you an email, by email, a request that you fill out a survey about this conference. And we would really greatly appreciate your doing that for us. You know, the whole conference in a way has been something akin to an experiment, and we definitely want to refine the model as we move forward. We are also hiring for multiple positions, so please circulate those in your networks and consider joining us. As you can see, we don't bite, at least over Zoom. And we also have some important substantive projects underway, wholly apart from the follow-ups from the meeting with Secretary Mayorkas. Stay tuned for news on those. We'll be sending that out in various channels as well. And with that, I will turn it over to Hiroshi.
Thank you very much, Ahilan, and thanks for everyone for being here this morning, or as we said, afternoon or evening. So, you know, after that wonderful summary or highlights, as I said, of what happened last week, I feel it's going to be a little letdown for me to spend just a couple of minutes talking about some logistics, but let me just do that, especially for those of you who weren't here last week. And if you've heard this before, thanks for your patience on this. Just a couple of things. One is that we're using Zoom webinar format, and so the only people you should see on the screen will be the panelists and the moderators and occasionally our conference organizing team. You'll need only one Zoom link for the whole day, but the link will not remain open the whole day. Instead, we'll bump everyone off at the end of each of the 3 sessions. So that means that you'll need to log back on at noon Pacific for the midday session, my conversation with Senator Padilla, and then again at 2 p.m. Pacific for the afternoon panel. And then I should add that for the morning and afternoon panels, the Q&A will be open. That means that those of us who are on the conference team will see your questions, but other people attending won't see those questions. And so during each session, some combination of the moderator and our conference organizing team will be reviewing those questions and trying to get them answered. The afternoon session will also be open to questions via Twitter, something we're experimenting with. And you'll hear more about that at the start of the session. I'm one of those folks who don't worry if you're not equipped or logged in or whatever that allows you to participate by Twitter. There are many of us who aren't. I'm one of those. Some of you know that my daughter told me a few years ago that I was too old for Facebook. So I'm one of those folks that will be in the Q&A via the Q&A. Okay, please don't be offended if we don't get to your question. We have hundreds of people registered for today, and we have approaching 150 right now as people are even just logging on. So we'll do our best to air as many questions as we can. The Q&A won't be open for the midday session with Senator Padilla, but I'll say more about that session in a minute. And 2 other quick logistical things. The chat will not be available. If you see a message in the chat, it's probably a logistical announcement from our conference team. And if you have any technical issues, please email us. And that is our center email. I'll say it twice. It's CILP@law.edu. I'm sorry. I knew I was going to mess that up. CILP@law.ucla.edu. CILP@law.ucla.edu. That's the toughest part of these opening remarks. Okay, so let me just take a few minutes and try to preview day 3 of this conference. Before doing that, I want to offer some thoughts on what we've set out to do in this event on 3 Fridays to mark the 100 days of the Biden administration. I hope that even though, of course, the obvious focus is immigration policy in the Biden administration, we're doing more than that. And I want to be explicit about what that is. We want to also open up lines of communications that we hope will flourish in the coming months and years. Our topics will shift and evolve, partly to reflect the full range of our priority areas for the center. There are many of them. I can only mention a few, but as I explained last week, one priority area is a searching examination of immigration and citizenship law as a side of racism and racial discrimination. A second area I mentioned last week, I'm not going to get into detail as I did last week about them, but I just want to name them, especially if you weren't here. The second is a rethinking of the role of states and of localities, state and local governments in the admission of immigrants in the United States. That's often thought of as a question of sanctuary or enforcement, but it's also a question of what the role is of states, for example, in the admission of immigrants. So that's the second priority area. And the third priority area looks ahead and asks, what's the relationship between the United States and the countries that migrants are leaving? And in other words, sending country conditions. And what about the countries through which migrants travel en route to their destinations? So those are some areas that we'll be looking at. But more generally, I just want to say that topics in these and other areas will call on us to expand our universe of conversation partners. And that will shift over time to include evolving combinations of government officials, academics, advocates, and members of affected communities. We want to bring together different groupings of people, some of whom think they agree, but may find more disagreement than they expect. And we also want to bring together people who think they disagree, but end up finding perhaps more common ground than they expect. So our conversations will sometimes also reach much more internationally than we have in this conference. So this conference is something that in many ways we expect and hope to do the same in the future, but differently. Okay, I should also add, we also hope to continue what we've tried to start in this conference in a more general sense, which is to create spaces for conversations full of reflection, challenge, creativity about tough and pivotal issues. Conferences and our gatherings and other gatherings are key venues for these conversations, and we've definitely seen that on these two Fridays that we've had, and I'm sure today as well. But we also look forward to working through many other vehicles for policy innovation and leadership. Of course, this includes the written word in many forms, and that, of course, is going to include policy documents, legislative proposals, and court briefs. So, as Ahilan already mentioned in recap, last week was full of generative conversations. One of them was Ahilan's dialogue with DHS Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas last Friday. And rather than putting him in the position of recapping his own conversation, let me try to offer some thoughts on it. First, some big picture thoughts. I want to pause to observe how extraordinary the conversation was. To have a sitting cabinet secretary come to talk publicly, not just about some of the most contentious issues facing his department and the Biden administration, but also to talk with a leading immigrants rights lawyer, Ahilan, who also happens to be opposing counsel in major litigation against the federal government. And the conversation was something like what you'd expect in a stakeholder meeting, except that it was in public, and not just for everyone at this conference, but also on live broadcast on C-SPAN. So it was a rare moment and a rare mode of government transparency. I think that's worth acknowledging. So Ahilan's questions are broad and deep. I won't try to summarize the content of the conversation, but I will give you a range of the conversation that he asked. Ahilan asked the secretary about the persistence of Title 42 border closures from the Trump era, about undoing wrongful deportations that were undertaken in retaliation for protest activities. Ahilan asked about justifications for immigration detention, about the need for the government to provide children with lawyers, about temporary protected status, about local governments' law enforcement role in immigration enforcement, and about the role of racism in immigration enforcement, past and present. Quite a bit to cover in an hour. At times, Secretary Mayorkas tried to reach out to persuade, and at other times, he was in full debate mode. And there were times when the secretary said simply, I hadn't considered that, but I promise I'll think about it. And as Ahilan mentioned, we've had conversations with the secretary's office since that conversation last Friday, and we certainly hope that we can have the secretary back on campus in person in the coming academic year. Now, just a few words about today's program, starting with what I know will be a superb morning panel on building power during the Biden administration, insider and outsider advocacy. Many people who consider themselves as part of the immigrants' rights movement have assumed influential positions in the Biden administration, but these new insiders may find themselves limited in the positions they can articulate and the decisions they can make. And advocates who remain outside the official administration face hard questions about whether and when to voice public praise or criticism of the government or to work back channel. And of course, this dimension, the spectrum from inside to outside, interacts with other dimensions in complicated ways. Do different immigrant groups experience the insider-outsider dynamic differently? I will also be speaking in a noon conversation today with Senator Alex Padilla. Senator Padilla not only represents California in the U.S. Senate, he's also chair of the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Immigration, Citizenship, and Border Safety. So to be transparent, I should disclose that I shared with the senator's office the topics I'd like to ask him about. So I'll tell you what they are. As Ahilan did last week with Secretary Mayorkas, I chose topics that were both relevant to the issues in this conference and things I know at least something about. So this plus time constraints means we won't cover many important issues. But I hope to ask Senator Padilla about pending legislation, especially on legalization of the path to citizenship, and also legislation on other important issues. relating to immigration. I hope to ask him how he sees the choices that lie ahead for the Immigration Subcommittee and for Congress as a whole. I also hope to ask Senator Padilla about the situation on the southern border of the United States and how he sees those developments as affecting the congressional debate. And the third broad area I want to ask him about is the role of state and local government. Senator Padilla's long service in local government in Los Angeles and the California State Senate, and as California Secretary of State, that all makes him uniquely able to speak to the connections among federal and state and local decision making. Okay, and in the afternoon, we have a fabulous panel planned on the fundamental question of who does what and when. What does it mean to expect action from Congress, the executive branch, from the courts? Is it right to push a legislative strategy before an executive one? What does it mean to focus too much on one branch and not on the others? And what's at stake in these choices? Okay, so I've already stood too long between you and the day ahead. So we will get to our first panel, and I want to pass the baton to your first moderator, Nana Jumphy. Nana's had and continues to have an illustrious and highly influential career as a leading voice for human rights and Black liberation. She's a co-founder of several organizations, including Justice Warriors for Black Lives, Human Rights Advocacy. She served as the executive director of the Black Women's Forum, and she's been a professor in the Pan-African Studies Department at Cal State University, Los Angeles. Nana is currently the executive director of the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, BAJI, which is an essential voice for the nearly 10 million Black immigrants, refugees, and their families living in the United States. And I'm very proud to say that Nana is a graduate of the UCLA School of Law. So Nana, it's all yours.
Thank you so very much, Hiroshi. And I want to start first by congratulating the center, congratulating you, Ahilan, everyone that's been involved with this conference. It has been fabulous, absolutely fabulous. So I want to thank you. And I want to welcome everyone again to this kickoff session of day 3 of the UCLA School of Law Center for Immigration Law and Policy Conference on Immigration Policy in the Biden administration. Hoping that you will all join me in those congratulations to the center. My name is Nana Jumphy, as just indicated, and my pronouns are she, her, and wonu in the Tree language of Ghana. And I'm the executive director of BAJI, the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, which is the largest Black-led racial justice and immigrant rights organization in the country. We advocate, educate, organize on behalf of the roughly 10 million Black migrants and our families here in the United States and those who want to be here in the United States. And I'm so honored to be moderating this opening session, Building Power During the Biden Administration, Inside versus Outside Advocacy. I'm pleased to be discussing this topic today with 3 powerhouse women who will help us navigate the sometimes tricky and high stakes terrain of the inside-outside game. So while I share their brief bios, here, they obviously have larger bios in the program. We're trying to make sure that we share most of what we are going to talk about specifically on the topic, but I would be remiss to not at least give some information about the fabulous sisters you're going to hear from today. Erica Andiola is the Chief Advocacy Officer for HISIS and former press secretary for Latino Outreach for Bernie 2016. She started her community organizing experience when she co-founded the Arizona Dream Act Coalition. She then served in the National Coordinating Committee and the Board of Directors for the United We Dream Network. Her personal struggle as an undocumented woman herself with an undocumented family has given her the drive and the passion to keep fighting for immigrant and human rights. Thank you for joining us, Erica. Angelica Salas is an immigrant from Durango, Mexico. She came to the United States as a child to reunite with her parents, who came to provide a better life for their family. Angelica comes to her understanding of immigrants and immigration firsthand. She and her entire family lived in the country undocumented, experienced deportation, and were able to legalize their status. Angelica joined Churla in 1995 and became Churla's executive director in 1999. She has grown Churla into one of the nation's largest and most effective immigrant rights organizations that organize, advocate, educates, and provide legal services to all immigrants. Thank you for joining us, Angelica. Stephanie Valencia is a national leader at the nexus of politics, technology, and leadership development. She recently served as political director at Investing in Us, a political venture capital fund focused on disruptive platforms and initiatives to enhance civic participation, and earlier ran strategic partnerships and outreach of Google. Stephanie is among a small group of advisors who served President Barack Obama in senior roles during his presidential campaign and both terms in office. She served as an aide to the president at the White House Office of Public Engagement, as Deputy Chief of Staff to U.S. Secretary of Commerce Penny Pritzker, and as Deputy Latino Vote Director on the 2008 campaign. Thank you so very much, Stephanie, for joining us, and to all of you for sharing again with us this morning. So I want to start out by helping people to get a little bit of context in terms of where we've been, where we are now, before we jump into this conversation. So if, I want to ask you to describe the relationship between the immigrant rights movement and past administrations, past executive branches, when you first started your work in the immigrant rights movement, and compare that to where we are today. And I'd like to start with Angelica.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Nana, and congratulations to UCLA for this incredible set of days of conferences and just dedicating it to the issue of immigration. So as you shared my bio with everybody, I've been working on immigration for some time now. Started at Churla when I was 24 years old, a long time ago, and became its executive director when I was about 28 years old. So it's been a while. I would say the first time I ever was inside the White House, and not in the White House, but certainly on the side, in the side buildings of the White House, was actually to meet Maria Echevestes, who at that time was working with Clinton, and we were pushing for legalization and amnesty. And there were advocates who were meeting. We weren't meeting directly with the president. We were meeting with one of the highest ranking Latinas inside the administration, and working to really push the idea of immigration reform. At that time, again, amnesty, we called it very clearly, we need amnesty for our folks, we need legal status. There hadn't been a legal status since '86. And in that moment, I would say the sort of the late '90s, the harshest immigration laws were passing. We had just come off of Proposition 187, and now we had just come out of the immigration, I always call it immigration deform of the 1996 immigration law. And so what I remember very well at that meeting, and there's so many things that were talked about, but certainly we were pushing for this, but the message that I got from Maria Echevestes at that moment was, look, we need to build power in this country. Yes, we had just come, and I remember now that this meeting was a result of the massive engagement by labor unions and by immigrant rights organizations around 2000 to just say, you know what, labor unions support the undocumented, no to employer sanctions, and yes to amnesty. He said, okay, you got labor on. Now tell me when you're going to get business on. When are you going to get Republicans in? You're never going to win this issue unless and she actually added we're not going to win this if we don't build more power and bring more at the table. So I feel like all these years working with these administrations, right? And then we've had administrations that were against us, but certainly in those who every year there are individuals who come inside the White House who we are working to basically demonstrate that America is with us, and that people are in support of our communities. But there was a certain moment, and I'll stop here, that I just said, you know what? We've done all that. We've brought business, we brought labor, the diversity of immigrants is not just Latino, et cetera. And there's still a resistance to change. And so I am so happy that in 2006, it was just, it is us immigrants coming forward, and we're demanding that you listen to us, through us, not just because others are in support of us. And certainly the faith community has come on board, et cetera. So that's sort of been my experience. And certainly, we could talk more about my experience with more with the Obama administration, et cetera. What I've seen year after year is that more and more people who support the idea that individuals should be legalized in this country and should have just basic rights because of who they are as humans, but also what their contributions are, that more individuals have actually entered inside the White House as leaders, that not only are supporting us, but more importantly, that we're able to push and try to influence. And I always am very clear: access does not equal power. Access does not equal power. What it means is that we just have to understand that our job is to influence and use access as one lever of influence.
Thank you so very much, Angelica. Wanted to make sure we got to as much to the root as we could get. And I know you've been doing this work a long time. Started when you were young, so the youth is still there. And the vibrance and the exuberance. And so we really appreciate that. I want now to turn to Erica. Erica, if you could share your experiences, given that, where you came into this immigrant rights movement, and what was the relationship with the administration at that time?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for putting this together. These are all just so great conversations with just amazing people. I think we can maybe fast forward a few years later to what Angelica was mentioning in terms of the fight in California, right? That really created so many, I wasn't there, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but what I've seen, through history is that it created so many leaders and so many people who really changed, not just California, but I think in so many ways, like the movement across the country. I started getting involved when Arizona was introducing anti-immigrant legislation in 2000. They tried way before this, but as I remember, I was a college student in 2008, and that's when I started learning about the anti-immigrant laws that Arizona was passing. And then it got all the way to 2010 when they were passing they did pass SB 1070, which a lot of people here called it the papers please law, which basically cops could just come to you and ask you for papers if they thought you were undocumented. And to me, this is during the Obama administration, right? Where to be very honest, I was not involved in politics at all. I was a college student. I was undocumented. I was struggling to figure out what I was going to do after college, unemployed after I graduated. So I had a lot of time in my hands in 2010 because I had graduated and I couldn't get a job because I was undocumented. I think that the necessity of wanting to have something, change in my life. And I saw that, sort of similar sentiment with a lot of my peers who I met in the university that I went to at ASU, and then eventually, sort of forming or being part of a bigger movement that was growing, and that now it's known as the Dreamer movement. That a lot of our peers, my peers, were going through a very similar situation, right? Where we were young, we were struggling as undocumented youth, and we wanted to survive. We needed to survive. And the way to do that was learning how to push, right? And at that time, it was the Obama administration. A lot of us were not coming from spaces that were already connected. We were not coming from spaces of political engagement, but rather of movement, of really just, thinking of strategies of how we could use pressure Obama. And I would say really very rooted in the truth, right, of the moment. And for us, the truth was seeing our families struggle. The truth was seeing, for me, my house being raided by ICE, under the Obama administration, and going through that trauma of seeing my own mother taken away in handcuffs in front of me and my 17-year-old brother. And a lot of that, you know, to be honest, it did create a lot of resentment, a lot of like, you say you're my friend, but you're going after my family, right? You're going after people I love, and you're not, you know, doing what you promised. And it wasn't necessarily that we had, you know, people, at least, you know, myself and a lot of us didn't necessarily have people inside who we knew necessarily very close, right? I remember Stephanie by name. I remember a lot of people by name, Cecilia, but it wasn't that I could pick up the phone and say, you know, I'm gonna call, you know, so and say, hey, you know, this is happening, I'm really angry, let's figure it out. It was just really out of let's keep pushing because we're suffering and we need a change. And so that's how it was, you know, in the Obama administration. I think eventually we were able to create some relationships. And you know, I think at the end of the day, a lot of us, and I think we're going to talk about this in this panel, you know, we have a lot of learned experience, right? And we're in a new situation after 4 years of hell, you know, to be honest, with the Trump administration, where we're still trying to figure it out. We have new relationships, we have new people in the White House, and also we have some similarities that, or at least we're trying to figure out if there are similarities or not, right? And a lot of us still carry some of that trauma. So I personally am trying to think through, like, how can we use this moment to not just get stuck in the trauma of working with our, you know, with our allies in the Obama administration, and sort of feeling like we're like not, you know, that we were not being listened to now we're many years later and there's new players and there's new people. So, you know, we're gonna see, we have a long way to go, and figuring things out with the Biden administration. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Appreciate that, Erica. And then Stephanie, you know, thinking as Erica was talking, I think about how for so many folks, they saw President Obama as their inside, even though they had never talked to him and maybe hadn't really looked at his politics, but they saw him as their inside. And I think that's where some of the disappointment comes in, right? Because I think of all of the 40 something presidents beforehand, who not many of whom were not so immigration friendly, but there's like a kind of a special about him, right? And I think part of it is his Blackness and how he presented, that folks felt like, oh, we got somebody in here that's gonna, you know, there's our knight in shining armor. So can you talk some about your, you know, first engagements in terms of the immigrant rights movement and whatever administration was in existence at that time, and then how that's progressed?
Right. Well, thank you so much. You know, my perspective is a little bit of a different perspective than Erica and Angelica. I've been the recipient of much of their advocacy for most of the last 15 years. I'm finally now on the outside, trying to help the cause from the outside in a different way, particularly in how we use research data and polling to tell a story about how Latinos specifically feel about the issue of immigration, and how we should, progressives should be leaning into the issue of immigration as a winning issue. So I'm on a different side of the fence here now, but I still think, you know, I started my career in 2004 on Capitol Hill, right as kind of as the George W. Bush administration was kind of restarting its efforts toward, and Congress was kind of re-engaging in the immigration debate in 2005 and 2006, and was working in the House Democratic Caucus at the time when the large immigration marches across the country were happening in 2006, and Democrats were, you know, still very much in a position of defensiveness on the issue of immigration. In some ways they still are, but I think even more so back then. And then I went over to the Senate and I worked for Ken Salazar, who, you know, has been a major proponent and partner and pusher in Congress on the issue of immigration for many, many years. In fact, he's being rumored to be ambassador to Mexico, which I think would be a really important, to have a partner like that in that role with the Mexican government at this really important moment in time is also kind of another person that we can see, I think, as an ally in the administration to the cause. And then I worked on the Obama campaign, as Nana mentioned, and worked in the Obama White House. Again, I was young, very young at the time. I think I was 25, 26 years old when I started working. I have lots more gray hair now, lots more experience, lots more things that I would have done differently. But I think that, looking back at our time there, I think we all, especially those of us who had worked on the campaign, similarly came in with high expectations for the president and for what it meant to be in power. And those were quickly dashed. I remember being sitting exactly where I was. I remember the day where the first major immigration raid happened of the Obama administration. It was a very clear signal that ICE didn't care that President Obama was in power, and that the leadership of ICE was really trying to kind of show that they were going to do things the way they wanted to do them. And looking back now, seeing kind of that moment, again, I remember exactly where I was when I got that call, and realized the real limitations of what we could and could not do when there was a live enforcement action happening in that moment. We couldn't stop it from happening. There were laws against us. I remember getting yelled at by the White House counsel because I was like, make them stop. It really was, but I couldn't actually, there was a limitation around what the White House could actually engage in with regard to that. So we quickly learned the limits of our own power inside the White House, even though expectations from ourselves and from externally were very, very high. And so I think that now, I spent most recently a good chunk of time over the summer and through the inauguration working on the Biden transition, helping to build the cabinet and helping to, get people put into kind of high levels of and positions of power in the Biden administration that reflect the Latino community, but also reflect a community of people who have experience in this issue that would help to advance this issue. So I think, Angelica, your point that we have a lot of friends in the administration today, access is not power. At least we are starting from a place in some ways that is, we don't have to educate certain people from a baseline. And I think that, we're at least already starting with a set of people in these positions who understand the importance of this issue. They will run into many of the similar limitations that we ran into in the Obama administration, but we also have many years of experience in how to navigate those. And what I will just say about my own kind of experience in the administration and in politics is that, similar to Angelica and Erica, I consider myself an organizer. I started as an organizer many, many years ago. Ultimately, that's what it really takes to work inside an institution like the executive branch or like Congress. It really takes kind of an organizer's mentality to align people, to align resources, to align process and systems toward a common goal. And, there's an element of that still has to kind of happen internally to the administration right now. I think there's a lot that has shifted and changed in the debate. I know we'll talk a little bit about this from when I started back in 2004 to where we are today. As I shared with the panelists kind of in our pre-call, to me, it's amazing to see, I think the Dreamer movement is probably one of the best lived examples of organizing that we will see in our lifetime around a policy issue, because they have really shifted the way that we think about young dreamers coming to this country, and candidates can't stop themselves from wanting to be aligned with dreamers. It's there's no question that you cannot even, it's not even a question whether you support the Dream Act or not anymore. And so there's more room for us to kind of push some of these other really critical issues that are facing the country right now in that similar direction. I think we have a lot of opportunity to do that in the moment in time that we're in right now, kind of coming out of the pandemic, and the role of immigrant essential workers, and, you know, the diversity of, you know, the immigrants that are in this country today, and telling that story of who is here, you know, presents like a lot of, gives us a really important opportunity to kind of move the issue forward in a very different way than I think we've had in the past.
Thank you, Stephanie. So thinking about some of what each of you touched on, particularly describing how you first were just standing outside the White House and talking to people, you know, the one Latina who's in there that can maybe have the conversation, to now having a space where you have more folks in. How do we, you know, we tried as best we could to manage expectations as organizers about what this administration was going to be about, right? And so I think the immigrant rights movement did learn from the knight in shining armor thing that, hey, maybe we shouldn't put people in that position, and really still understand that we're going to have to fight. I think we did, you know, some work on doing that, and maybe not all organizations, but many of our organizations in the immigrant rights movement with respect to this Biden administration. And yet we have more people from the immigrant rights movement in this administration than we've had in the past. So in terms of moving things forward, how much do you think we should be looking at public criticism as what's gonna, you know, be what we should do more of on balance, and how much of it was going to be based upon these back channels, for lack of better expression? And I'm thinking, for example, about these Title 42 expulsions, right? And some of the things that are impacting Black migrants, whether it's the criminal bars and this legalization pathways, whether it's the expulsions, the enforcement priorities. Like, you know, from Baji's perspective, Black folks are still in the anti-Black mode. I mean, we're not in a mode where we're seeing a lot of forward movement. And yet there are places where we are seeing some forward movement, where we'd like to, you know, bring those things up as well. But so it's hard to figure out, should we be really criticizing or not? A little easier for Black folks because we're on the short end of the stick, a little harder for folks who see themselves reflected in this administration. What say you? And I'm going to start on this with Erica.
Yeah, it's a hard question. I mean, it's at least as I was sharing earlier, you know, this is, I think, for me, and I would say for many of my peers who were so used to being the ones in the outside pushing, right, and advocating, and then going into the Trump administration and just completely, I mean, obviously you all know how that experience was. Obviously we didn't have any allies or friends inside of the White House. Now, you know, it's a whole, at least for me, it's a new experience of figuring out, you know, people who I literally work with in other organizations, right, who are my coworkers now, seeing them, you know, inside, and then having the power, in so many ways, a lot of power. I do think that it is important that we continue to root, again, as I said earlier, to root ourselves in the truth and what is actually happening. And if the truth right now, not only if, it is the truth that there is people who are being deported because of Title 42, and that many of those folks are Black folks, and that they, you know, we see, at least, you know, with Raices, we do provide a lot of direct services in detention centers, and also family detention centers and children's detention. And we have seen the treatment of Black women that's way different than other folks, right, who are not Black. And we have to say that, right? We have to be very outspoken and say really what the truth is. Now, once you get to the root of the problem and you see what the problem is, it really is about figuring out what the strategy is, right? Like, what is the most strategic thing to do? And I think that's where the tough question comes in front of us. You know, should we first approach our friends and say, hey, this is a problem? And if the problem is not being solved, do we go out and start pressuring, or is it the other way around? And to be honest, I think we're still trying to figure that out. from the perspective of Raíces, we are being outspoken, right? We are saying what we're seeing, and I think we could be doing a lot more. I think we should be doing a lot more, and I think a lot of other organizations, right, could and should be doing a lot more in terms of painting the picture of what the reality is that our communities are still going through. And I know we have a little bit of time, but the last thing I'll say is that it is important to acknowledge the progress, and that's important because all of us are just so tired. We're so excited. I'm exhausted. Trump just literally like took so much out of my life. It's just it was exhausting, and so now it is important that we acknowledge that there has been progress from what we saw under the Obama administration to what we see now under Biden. So that's important to acknowledge, and also it is important that we just, again, don't look away from the truth of what is still happening, and are the people who are detained right now, the people who are still, suffering because of the system and what's going on, they can care less who's in the White House. They are still suffering, and we should be the ones speaking out, and working with them to ensure that those injustices are gone. And until they're gone, right, we can all maybe just perhaps sit back at some point and let the administration do what they need to do, but that's not going to be the case anytime soon.
Thank you, Erica. Let me go to you, Stephanie.
So I want to make three really quick points. One is truth telling, and Erica, I agree with you. Like, I think that is the most powerful tool that we have, is telling the truth right now, telling what you're seeing on the ground. One, as horrible and destructive as everything that happened in the Trump administration was, one thing that I think came out of it was that the country, and in particular, many people who are sitting in the White House today, saw things that many folks who have been working in this space for a long time have been seeing for years and years and decades. Abuse, corruption in places like ICE and CBP, just how broken the system is. And I think that one thing that I kind of witnessed during the transition, and I saw today, there was a moment in kind of the first couple of days of the Biden administration where Jen Psaki, the press secretary, is a very good friend of mine, was up at the podium talking about immigration that Robert Gibbs would have never talked about in that way. And it really just showed kind of how the Biden team and how the administration had kind of, and the country has really evolved in some ways. In some ways we absolutely have not, but just like how the consciousness of what is happening is very different now than it was 10 years ago. And I think that presents a really important opportunity. And again, that's part of the truth-telling work that you all do every single day. I think the second piece is really important, is around continuing to make a political case that acting on immigration and is not just makes policy sense, but makes political sense and is in the self-interest of politicians to take action. And that there are high levels of expectation for a reason around immigration and high levels of expectation for action around immigration. And that like inaction will also have a very important cost. And there are really, I think, critical examples around that. We can think about Harry Reid in 2010 in Nevada, leaning in on the DREAM Act and the positive political implications that had for him. Mark Kelly and Catherine Cortez Masto and other people need to get that memo and remember that like that action here is really important, as do other moderate Republicans. And then the third thing I would just say, kind of relating back to the administration and the kind of category of things that, hindsight gives more clarity on, is that one of the problems that I think that happened, and I know that many folks have been critical of Cecilia Munoz, and I know, she is one of, in my mind, one of the kindest, most humble human beings that I've ever worked with in the policy space. That being said, I think that like one of the mistakes that was made in the Obama administration is basically it was all put on her shoulders. There was no real ownership across other parts of the administration. And there needs to be ownership kind of created in other parts of the administration, from the chief of staff to the entire cabinet to all levels of the White House, to want to see this issue get done. Like, this issue should not just be handed to the most senior Latina in the White House and say, you're responsible for this now. And I think that that is kind of what happened in the Obama administration in a lot of ways. And Cecilia was given kind of outsized expectations. She, I think, did what she could with the power that she had. And, that can be another discussion. But I think, one thing that is, we tell the truth and as we talk about who we're trying to organize and who we're trying to convince, like, it really does need to be, and also not just the White House, right? Like, this also needs to be, members of Congress, leadership in Congress, leadership of the political committees in Congress, moderate Democrats and moderate Republicans in Congress. So I think, again, that role of truth telling and making this in people's political interests and making that case are critical ways to create that ownership.
Thank you. And Angelica, I know that this is an area that you navigate all the time, and you're having one of the nation's largest organizations that organizes, right? That's actually engaged in organizing, and at the same time being connected to folks in the administration that are in leadership in Congress. How much of the work do you think should be public criticism, and how much should be more of these back channel kind of conversations?
Well, the way I see it, I think the question is kind of off, in the sense that you actually, the first, I want to say, I agree with my colegas with it when they say, no, you first have to connect your those who are in support of your cause, any cause, certainly here in the issue of immigration, with the reality of what is happening on the ground and in people's lives. Like, they deserve to hear that, and you have a responsibility to connect them to that reality. There shouldn't be any sugarcoating about what's actually happening. There is so much suffering, and there's so much destruction in people's lives, and they need to hear that, because in understanding the reality, it really allows them to create the internal urgency, because many times they're fighting internally to ensure that these issues move forward. So I believe that connecting our friends in the inside to that reality actually helps them fight with us. And then that's the other part that I wanted to really talk about is, yeah, we need to be critical when things are moving in the wrong direction, and publicly critical. We also need to be publicly supportive when things are actually moving in the right direction, so that we can create a contrast between what it is we don't want and what it is we do want, and when things are actually moved forward. But the other part is about problem solving together and figuring it out. It's not enough to just say we're critical of what you're doing. We also have to work to figure out, well, what is a different path forward? And I think that's where it's not so much in working in inside channels. It's about working with people who agree with you in the inside to then figure out what is the power that needs to be built in order for things to go in a different way. There are folks who are just like, I'm just going to be critical. That's my role. I am not going to work around what is then the solution to this. And I see it a lot sometimes on the local level, when we just say no, the answer is no, but there isn't a no. This is the path forward. And so that's the other piece. The other thing is that I think that we also have to, as we do organizing on the outside, when we're talking to our community and engaging our community and being powered by our community, there is an element of organizing which is about being aware of the power you do have. And it is about making sure that our community knows, no, we have power. We have power to move our elected officials. We have the power to advance in a direction that's going to be better for our lives. On the inside, our colleagues also need to see the breadth of the power they do have. It was not acceptable to me to hear President Obama say that he didn't have power to move on our issue. He was the president of the United States, the most powerful man in the world, and one of the most powerful persons in the world. And for me to hear from him that he didn't have the power to do certain things, that was unacceptable. And so to me, it's really important to always make sure that we're pushing on the inside so people not only understand the fullness of their power, but use it on our behalf and on our issues.
Thank you so much for that, Angelica. And I'm so there with you on how we're talking to our communities, rooting ourselves in resistance and resilience, rooting ourselves in the power that we have, and also, you know, sort of the thinking about the people that are in power. How do we get them to use that power and not see themselves as helpless? I'm like, wait a minute, you in these spaces, and you know what I'm saying? If we have power here on the street, I know you got power, and so I think that's really important. And so, speaking of that, Stephanie, what do you think is the most beneficial role that the movement's friends in the administration or advocates in the administration can play in moving our agendas forward? So I'm talking about the in the administration people, right? That folks feel like, hey, these are people that just 4 months ago were in these meetings with us, and now hear that, you know, they're now in the administration itself. You know, some of them may be peeping. I'm sure there's a few that are here looking and hearing from us. What would we say is the most beneficial role that they can play in assisting us in moving our agendas forward?
I would say a couple things. I think, and again, this is hindsight and clarity from my time there. You know, I think that there is a natural place where people who are in those roles of power want to protect their principal from bad things. And they want to stop the protests. They want to stop Erica and Angelica from like chaining themselves to the White House fence. Like, please don't do that. Like, that's not helpful, right? At the end of the day, I think what I kind of shifted my view when I was at the White House, and I think folks in the White House or in the administration need to kind of see themselves more as facilitators and communicators rather than kind of protectors. And I think that, you know, that is, to Angelica's point, there's a lot of ugliness and destruction and you know, that we can't sugarcoat it. And I think that, you know, they have to see their role as being truth tellers internally also. And I think one of the benefits that you do have from the people who are in the administration right now is many of them served in the last administration. You know, with that comes a lot of baggage, but I think also with that comes a lot of experience. And it would be one thing if we were starting fresh with a bunch of people who were in these positions who were trying to navigate, you know, DHS or trying to navigate, you know, the White House or the interagency process. And so I think that, you know, there's a lot of positivity in that too, because you have people who are starting from a stronger place and a more experienced place than you do kind of where we started at the beginning of the Obama administration. Was truly, it had been 10 years since, and DHS wasn't even an agency in the Clinton administration. And so you had a whole set of systems to navigate that we had to figure out. So I think like that is probably like my biggest advice is, you know, be a facilitator and a communicator and help to facilitate what, you know, Erica and Angelica and other advocates are kind of giving you to other parts of the White House, and not to shield it or stop it from happening, but to really kind of help make sure that the people at the highest levels of the White House really know and understand what's happening on the ground, what's happening in the agencies, you know, what's happening in communities across the country, and how immigration policy is actually being implemented on the ground. I think that that truth telling again is just like so critically important. You know, doing that through, and obviously in doing that through media, but I think, you know, making sure you're not shielding from the truth. I think the other thing I would just say is on, you know, on the policy side of things, I think that, you know, one of again, a benefit of kind of where we're starting now is, well, you know, Susan Rice is newer to this issue, and people like Jake Sullivan at the National Security Council, you know, there seems to be more kind of cohesion between these two elements that, at least in my experience, were kind of very siloed in the past. You know, there's obviously a huge national security component to everything that is happening right now. There's a huge domestic component to that too. And those two kind of parts of the administration really need to be in better coordination and in better kind of communication. And so I think to the extent that our colleagues in the administration are thinking about how to make those two kind of work better together, that is also really important for kind of just longer term systematic like integrity and how we make the system work better longer term. You know, you really have to marry those two systems together.
Thanks, Stephanie. Angelica, uh, any thoughts to add to what Stephanie has already laid out?
Oh, I would just say that they all, many times on the inside, they see where the problem is. Like they know what's the barrier? Who's the barrier? What's happening here? And I think sometimes I really appreciate what Stephanie said about the protecting, because they also have to be, and we have to be welcoming of the truth that needs to be said from the inside. But it helps, I believe, a more truthful engagement allows for then our organizing heft and our targeting to be more strategic. And so I think that it's important because I do believe that there are so many important issues that this nation is confronting, so many people in difficulty. And I think we all need to recognize that there's a lot of balancing to try to do the right thing for as many people as possible. What I'm not accepting of is that immigrant communities are always left behind and always last to the table, if even invited to the table. That is unacceptable to me after all of these years and after all our work on the ground, in order for many of them to actually have the positions they have in many of, and this is both congressional members, senators, and members and people in the White House. It was our sweat equity on the ground that got a lot of these folks elected. And so to me, it's also important to recognize that we as immigrant communities I feel, certainly after all these years, that we are always, this morning there was an NPR news, news story, and it came out, and it's like, one more time it's a better, we need a better time for immigrant communities. For 35 years, people have been needing a change for 35 years. The 30-year-old that came here to the United States, or maybe the 20-year-old that came to the United States in 1986 or after, that person is now 65 years old, 55 years old. When is that better time for that person? And so I feel like it's really important to just state that to our friends too. It's like, we cannot always be the ones that are never who are never important enough to actually be made a priority in a progressive and democratic administration.
Thank you for that, Angelica. Thank you. Erica, what is, from your perspective, having been the young person, undocumented, who, was standing, yelling at the gate, and now being in the position you are, whereas, as you said, you have folks that are inside on the other side of the gate in the glass house over there. What do you think in terms of that balance between public criticism and back channel conversations? Or sorry, what do you think about, I'm going back to the wrong question. What do you think about the beneficial role that your movement friends in the administration can play?
I'll start by saying that it is a good thing to have people we think are great inside. I think that's what we've been. Whoop, my phone's ringing. I'm so sorry about that. I think one of the when we had people like Steve Miller working in the Trump administration, one of the things that when Biden won, I was like, we need the opposite. Like we need the complete opposite of Steve Miller in the Biden administration, right? And to me, it was just like this need of wanting somebody inside, or more than somebody, right? More than one person to be the organizers, like Stephanie said, like the organizers inside who will be moving things, who can use their power. So I think it is a good thing to have people inside. I would say that I resonated, just with a challenge of, I think just in general in politics, we still are dealing with, I think in a lot of political campaigns, many times, political campaigns obviously become, offices of elected officials at some point when people win. But I think even in political campaigns, and someone who worked in one with Bernie, I think there's still this, usually is the Latino or Latina or Latinx person who ends up taking on immigration, right? And I'm just gonna say it straight up. It's usually the Latino, and it's interesting because sometimes it's like you are in charge of immigration and Latino issues. First of all, of course, immigration is not just a Latino issue. And secondly, most of the time you get charged with figuring it all out. It's like you're gonna have to figure out what the Latino outreach is gonna look like. You're also gonna have to reach out to all the immigration organizations. And so, to me, I want to say this just because I acknowledge that sometimes being the one person who is inside, trying to figure out these two issues that perhaps, there is a lot of issues that Latinos are going through. Part of it is immigration. And then there's a lot of issues on immigration that are not just, tied to the Latino community. And you're trying to figure it all out at the same time. So I get that part. I would say that in the question of, should we have outside pressure? I think it's crucial that we do. And again, as someone who worked inside of a campaign where, for example, Bernie, right? He wasn't perfect on immigration. Let's just be honest, right? Like he had his blind spots and all of that in 2016 when I was working there. And to me, I sometimes took it personal when I saw criticisms from the outside. And I think it got to a point where I really got to that moment where I was like, you know what, that is a good thing. I need people outside screaming at Bernie for not saying or doing the right thing on immigration, if that is the actual truth of what's going on, especially people who are affected by the issue, because that allows me as a person inside to be able to use that leverage, right? To go to my boss and say, listen, you haven't gotten rid of Title 42, or you haven't done this, or you haven't done that. Now, are things happening inside? Perhaps there are, but the truth is that not all of us have contacts in the White House. Not all of us have those relationships. And there will be people like little Erica in 2010, well, I wasn't, it was like 22, who's not gonna be calling the White House. It's gonna be outside of the White House, screaming or yelling or sitting in or whatever it is, and that is okay. That is movement building. That is to me, the power of youth organizing. And the last thing I'll say is I sometimes do think right now, I really wish and hope that there is a new youth movement that arises, that it's not me, that it's not a lot of us, right, who are already, we're seasoned. We have a lot of the experience. But look at all the new undocumented youth, not the dreamers, the kids that I'm, interviewing every day in the detention centers where children are at. They're going to be the new young people who are going to have the same problems or even worse problems than I did when back in 2010, not being able to go to school, not even able to get a job, being afraid of getting detained, deported. And so I do have that hope and that dream that those folks, just like we did back in the day, are going to get together somehow, and they're gonna create a movement from the ground that are gonna put all of us in our feet and get us to act, and our friends in the White House to act faster.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I'm thinking and reflecting on something that Stephanie had said, that you both spoke to, and you spoke to just now, Erica, with respect to how you were feeling at first, like sort of the protector in a way, and how we shift that. And I think that when we look even now in this moment with all of the stakes, right, everything that people are hoping for and wishing for, and all the work, as Angelica pointed out, that people put in, right, the sweat equity, the everything that people laid out on the table, the risks that people took in order to make some of these huge shifts electorally, including getting the president and vice president elected here. Sometimes I think we're seeing that even within our movement, there are people and organizations that seem to be protective of the administration, frankly, and acting in that role, looking at how much they put in to get this administration, the fact that they have folks in the administration and what the stakes are in this moment. And pushing back against some organizations such as Baji, who are really, critical with the alternatives in hand about what's happening right now. So as immigrant rights leaders with inside contacts, what obligation do we have in terms of that balance? You know, on the one hand, we have put people or gotten people into office. We want those people to have a chance to do the right thing. On the other hand, we have our communities with, you know, pitchforks and torches who are thoroughly upset about a particular issue. How do you navigate that? You know, the kind of desire to protect, and at the same time, you know, in terms of protecting the administration or people within the administration, particularly people try to get in, right? The people worked hard to get in there, and addressing the needs of the community. And I'll start with you, Angelica.
Well, I think we all have to be for advancement. You know, this is the other thing. It's like we can stay stagnant in our idealism of everything that the perfect way that things should be. I think we have the power to stand where we know the solutions that need to happen, not just domestically, but globally, and really pay attention to what's happening outside of our borders to understand the kind of, you know, what's going to be happening now in terms of migration. And I think sometimes we're too domestically centered. So we have to understand and be cognizant of what our ideal reform is. And I would say transformation is even a better word of our transforming our immigration system. And to me, it's important to be connected to that long-term agenda. And I would even call it the medium-term, immediate agenda, because these things need to change in order for people to have a different life. What I sometimes push against, and it's not even a defense of the administration, it's really about internally, we can't stay stagnant by basically saying this is the way things should be, and I will not move an inch unless they are exactly the way that you know, sort of our ideal thing. And so I'm not going to engage, I'm not going to push forward, I'm not going to accept, you know. And so to me, there's a part of we have to, you know, and I love Make the Road New York, you know, make the road by walking it, right? And I feel like that's just like the perfect name for an organization, right? Because it's about making the road by walking it, like getting to that ideal, but not staying stagnant, and not wanting to engage with the administration, not understanding the you know, not seeing what are the barriers, where do we have to push through in order for that thing that we're not getting, you know, we're not advancing in order for that to happen. And I'll be very specific. I think like right now, we have a real issue around criminal justice within immigration, and immigration within criminal justice, right? Because, you know, we have a difficulty in actually changing the reality of the way that individuals who have had criminal violations and situations in their lives, even as young people, as older people, you know, that don't allow them to access the very things we're fighting for. This is a major, major part of our work that we have to fight forward. And so I think for me, it's right now, we like our U.S. Citizenship Act. It's not perfect, but it is the most progressive bill we have ever had. And so for me, it is important that we see the whole and move things. And in that process of creating momentum, build the power. So the hard things, the really hard things, which is about access to our immigration system from people who have committed criminal violations, and that they also have access to it. I believe that our Latinx and our Black folks, our Asian folks who are immigrants actually have double penalties. Not only are they dealing with the criminal violation and that punishment, but in addition to that, there is the additional punishment of deportation because of that, but also not able to even access the very benefits that we're fighting for. And so we have to change that, but this is really, really hard. And so in acknowledging how hard it is, I think that we need to understand that it's going to take us longer, but that we need to continue to fight and move forward, as opposed to saying, no, we're not for any of this, and we're just going to stay put and say no, no, no to everything that comes forward. So I know that this is a place where we have to continue to work, Nana, on this, but to me, it is just not, sometimes it's like, how much more power do we have to build in order to get through these hard things, and recognize that we have to do it, and recognize how hard some of these pieces are.
Absolutely. Thank you. I think of my uncle who has already, when he came to this country, had to just deal with being Black in this country in a way that was, not what he had to deal with in Ghana. I think of the criminalization that occurred with him, not because Black immigrants commit crimes more than anyone else, just as African Americans don't, but just because he is Black. And I think about that 35 years that you've talked about, and how he's waited that 35 years, and, just concerned that he'll have to wait another 35, may not make it to that time period, but we live long. My great grandmother lived to 128. But, I don't want him to have to be 110 before he sees the capacity to access benefits as a as a criminalized person, right? So thinking about these things, and how really critical, it is to think about how we want to move and how we're moving. Erica, I pass the question to you in terms of how we are looking at the role that we play as immigrant rights leaders with inside contacts and our obligations to our communities.
Yeah, I mean, I would preface whatever I say with, I think we're still learning, or at least I'm still learning in this new context of a new administration, some new players, and also to be, just very, very frank and honest, there are a lot of players from the Obama administration who are still there, and who might still have some of the same sort of hesitations, or even, maybe this is a strong word, but some of the trauma, right, from relationships that we had back in the Obama era. And so I wouldn't say that like I have just like, hey, I'm just gonna call my buddies at the White House and see, if they can do something for us. It's still an interesting dynamic. Now, I would say that just what I've learned, or what I can remember, and what I reflect on from the Obama era, was that it should be, or it is okay to get out of the way in some ways, and allow for folks right now who don't have that voice, who don't have that seat at the table, to take the seat, right? And what I reflect on, and what I remember from the Obama era, is that it was mostly the same players over and over and over again, the same, a lot of the same meetings with the same people. And a lot of the, back then, a lot of the undocumented youth, the what we called ourselves at that time, the dreamers, it was frustrating sometimes, right, to see that we were the ones affected. We were the ones who were seeing our own families being, torn away from us, or, and we were the ones really struggling, and yet we said the same players, the same people over and over again in the same meetings. And, now that I think from my experience back then, all I can think of, there's a lot of new voices, and I am so grateful that there is now a lot of really amazing new voices of people who don't look like me, who don't come from where I came from, who are still immigrants, and who are saying, you're not listening to me. You're not listening to what my community has been going through or is going through. And it is important that, as advocates who perhaps have some access, that we are creating those spaces, right, for those folks who are trying to get their voices heard, to have that seat at the table. Now, having the seat at the table doesn't mean that you're going to win or anything that you want, as Angelica said earlier. It just means that you at least have a seat at the table, and you can try to figure out what to do with it, right? And you can strategize about it, and you can figure it out. But I think that's one thing that I really learned, and that I haven't necessarily being able to practice as much because we are in a new administration. And again, at a personal level, I'm still trying to figure out the new dynamics. But I think we know we should be a lot more conscious about that, and especially, you know, Latinos and Latinas, Latinx folks. We're very much, you know, our community is very used to, for the most part, have representatives on the table. So, you know, just thinking through that and making sure that we are creating those spaces.
Thank you, Erica. Thank you. Thank you for that. Stephanie, as someone who's been connected to the folks and been on the inside, what is the obligations as immigrant rights leaders? You've been an organizer yourself. What obligation do we have to our communities as we're navigating this space?
I mean, I have one simple point here, and maybe it doesn't answer your question directly, Nana, but I think that one of the things I think we kind of have to push and question with regard to government and the people who represent us is ensuring that impacted people are in those positions of power as well. And I think that, or the people who are in power, if they are not impacted people directly, that they are finding ways to see the direct impacts of policy. And I think that is true beyond the issue of immigration. When we are working on poverty policy, you know, ensuring that people have exposure to the real life impacts and implications of how policy is implemented with regard to policy, or having teachers in positions of authority in policy making around education policy. So I think this is like something that I think we'd have to push and question within our structures of government and representation beyond this issue of immigration, is how we ensure that like impacted people are at the policymaking table as policymakers themselves, not just coming in for a meeting, but also how we think about the people who are in positions of policymaking power. I have this dream that for every 5 years you serve in government, if you are making policy and working on policy that impacts particular people, you have to go spend 6 months or a year working on the ground somewhere to try to better understand the input. Because somebody who's been working on poverty policy in 20 years, maybe started their career working on poverty, but that hasn't been on the ground to see the latest evolution of how policy is being implemented. And so I just think that like that is something we really need to kind of push, you know, people who are in Washington, who in a lot of ways are have been in these systems of government for a very long time, far removed from what's happening on the ground. And so that's something that, you know, providing, you know, I think CODELs are very important experience for members of Congress to see things. And, you know, I know there have been several CODELs down to the border to see what's happening in terms of processing in the migrant intake facilities. But I do think that there is more to be done in that regard, and something we should continue to push, and things that I think, you know, the groups and advocates also can help to open doors of opportunities. You know, there's a balance between, of course, feeling like, you know, opportunities of exposure like that, feeling voyeuristic, but on the other hand, like a really important exposure to people who are making policy to what's happening on the ground. And I think finding that right balance between the two is really important right now.
Thank you, Stephanie. So I'm looking in the Q&A and I'm seeing something is happening. The thing that's happening is people are so engaged in our conversation that they're not putting down their questions. So if you have questions, please take the time to do that now. We're going to do our best to, you know, answer these questions. I'm going to ask folks to answer a little more quickly, even though I'm so enjoying the conversation, so that we can make sure to get to the questions that folks have for us. But please, folks, in the chat, if you could please put your questions so that we can try to get to as many of them as we can before we close out today, I would really appreciate it. I know that folks are eager to hear also from you and make this as interactive as possible, at least, you know, before we close out. How do we make sure that, and something that Erica spoke of, how do we make sure that the needs and aspirations of communities that frankly are pretty marginalized in the immigrant rights movement, whether that be Black folks, Asian folks, Pacific Islanders, Indigenous migrants, how do we make sure that they're included in the discussions and that their needs and aspirations are included in the discussions being had with the administration? And let me start off on that question with Stephanie.
Mute here. Look, I think that, at the end of the day that we have to continue to ensure that, as I just said, that we have the right people at the policy making table, that we are making this political argument to Congress and to the policymakers inside the White House to ensure that they see this in their political self-interest, and that, we're telling the truth, and we're telling and lifting up the truth in the stories of everyday people and what is happening on the ground in communities across the country. And that is, I think, part of what our most important tool is. As I said at the beginning, the evolution that I have seen on this issue over the last 15 years to go from a place of seeing, dreamers fighting in the streets to, walking from Miami, Gabby Pacheco and others walking from Miami to meet with President Obama, those really kind of compelling actions, I think really do help to shape and move. And I want to make sure that, as we take a step back and look at, there's so much more to be done. There's so much more pressure that needs to happen. But I want to make sure that the advocacy community really can take a step back and see and be and feel good about the evolution that they have created over the last 15 years on this issue, because I know Erica and Angelica and others have been working on this, and Nana, you working on this all, especially these last 4 years, has taken a lot of out of everybody. But knowing that, we're at this really critical kind of precipice and moment where, again, this moment that we found ourselves in post-pandemic, that there's like this opportunity when we have Biden, where I think, a lot of advocacy efforts have helped to move him in a more positive direction on the issue, that there is enough there to kind of keep that momentum moving forward to get us to a better place on the policy, both administratively and legislatively.
Thank you. I'm thinking about, Erica, how do we get these other voices that you described before, even in the room? So when I think about the Sanders-Biden or Biden-Sanders Immigration Task Force, there were no Black people on it. And Baji led like a group of other Black immigrant leaders to have a separate meeting, which didn't occur till after most of the work had been done, when we found out that there were no Black people on it, to make sure that, we're there. It's like nothing about us without us, is one of the immigration rights movement's cries, right? And we find that happens. I think we've been able, as a Black immigrant rights subsection or whatever of the movement, to be able to be in many more conversations, and that the hint was gotten, and that we were, reached out to, and particularly about issues that impacted our communities. But, what can we do in order to make sure that in these discussions that our friends are helping to lead, that these other voices are there? Erica, your thoughts?
Yeah, there's so much to it, and I feel like we can have a whole other panel with a lot more other amazing people to try to crack the code in the immigrant rights movement. But what I would say is that the challenge that I see is that there is this, and maybe we helped create this sort of assumption in the political world and in the advocacy world, that although immigration impacts, and I kind of said this a little bit earlier, immigration impacts a huge percentage of the Latino community. That is true, right? There is a lot of people in the Latino community, Latinx community, who are impacted by immigration. However, we have, I think, through I don't really know exactly why, and maybe Stephanie, this is kind of your work, right, on figuring out a lot of like public perception and figuring out why. But there is a perception that immigration is still a Latino issue, a Latinx issue, and it's not just in the public. I think it is also in politics in Washington, in many advocacy movements. I think when folks think of who to bring on the table, or to conversations or whatever it is, they still think of the Latinx community, right? And I think that this specific narrative and perception does have an impact on how we are bringing in the voices and the perspectives, and even uplifting the stories of people who are not, right, who, like I said earlier, don't necessarily look like me or come where I came from. And so I don't have the exact answer. I do think that it is important that, you know, us as or folks like myself who are Latinx, who are very much used to being called to, you know, by reporters or, you know, spaces to represent on immigration, that we are ensuring that we're lifting up the truth of this, right? Is that immigrants obviously reflect the world because we come from all over it. And so it's sort of like, excuse my language, but no S, right? Like, immigrants are gonna look very diverse because we come from all over the world. But I think we have to start now, and I am so grateful for Baji and for a lot of just organizations from different, you know, AAPI community organizations that are now really, you know, they're organizing so much, not just within the communities that they represent, but also, honestly, I feel like y'all are really organizing the immigrant rights movement. Perhaps we haven't made the progress that we need to make, but I can see that it's a very different dynamic than it was 10 years ago, right? When it was still accepted that it was mostly a Latinx issue. So we gotta, I don't have all the answers. I do think that it is important that we are at least acknowledging that that is the case, and that we're working towards ensuring that other voices are included in conversations with power holders, or even within the immigrant rights movement, that we are uplifting the stories of what immigration really is, a diverse issue.
Thank you, Erica. Angelica.
Well, I think first to your first question, which is about place at the table, right? And just inclusion. I think that it's important for, you know, certainly for Baji, for other organizations, to be included in the broader table in order to be seen as part of the advancing sort of a very complex and inclusive immigration reform justice agenda. I also think that there has to be moments in which the engagement from Congress, from the Senate, from the White House has to be independent, in a sense that Baji and many other Black organizations are talking deeply about the issues, so that there's more comprehensions as opposed to just added on or included in. And so to me, it's about breadth and inclusion, and it's also about depth. And so in many, you know, imagine, for example, when you talk about indigenous communities, immigrant communities, that there'll be a roundtable with the diversity of indigenous migrant communities here in the United States, which are from Mexico, from Central American diverse countries, and from South America. I mean, there's just a lot of diversity even within those communities. And I don't have to tell you, Nana, you've educated me on this. It's like, you know, it's not just Ethiopian, it's not just Cameroonian, it's just like it's a diversity of countries that people come from. So that's my first point on that. It's like inclusion and also independent and depth and real understanding. And I think that needs to happen. And that's what I would definitely, it's like I want to push for. And then there's the other part, which I just feel so strongly about this. Yes, immigration is an issue of many people from around the world, and we are so diverse. But immigration enforcement lands on the backs of only a few. And so 94% of the people who have been detained and deported from this country are Latinos. They're from Mexico, they're from Central America and South America. And then if you do the other, well, that's like our Black brothers and sisters, our Black immigrant communities. And there's a longevity of stay. Like if you look at how long people stay in detention, it's going to be a blackface. And so to me, it's really important that we understand like it's like, how are we inclusive? And also, how are we particular? And we say, if we do not advance, who's going to take the brunt of a deportation? Who's going to take the brunt of deportation? If we don't fix the asylum situation at our borders, who are the people suffering? What do they look like? And they look, they are Central American and Mexicanos and Black people. And so to me, it's also important that as we move and advance a solution, we also understand that this is a racist policy built on exclusion of people, on Black and brown people and Asian and the Asian community. If you look back as to how our system of immigration it's always been built on excluding the other as perceived by white America. So to me, it's important that we center race as we move forward. And in doing so, I think we can have just a much more powerful movement and get to solutions that really confront those who are actually dealing with the brunt of the stick of the immigration system.
Thank you so very much. Really appreciate that. I want to get to some of these questions. Now suddenly there's a bazillion questions. So now I'm like trying to see. So I'm going to try to get to as many of them as we possibly can. So there's a question that I think is a top of mind for a lot of folks, which is if we do not get this federal legislation or only get parts or pieces of it, what do you think about more aggressive direct action with our friends which I'm assuming doesn't mean beating them in the side parking lot, who more fully control the levers of power in state governments? So looking at the state, but I would add also in terms of the administration, the focus of this discussion, what more can we do? Is it just conversation? How do we get more, push more and press more if in fact this federal legislation doesn't happen? And anyone can answer.
I'll start by saying, I think before we move to that piece around kind of where do we focus in the states, because I think regardless of what happens at the federal level, I would almost say even more so if there's action at the federal level, there will be more action at the state level, because, as we've seen with these crazy voting rights laws happening across the country, the Republicans are very, very good at a coordinated state-based legislative strategy. And so I think we have to be very cautious and mindful of like what kind of bad stuff could come up in Republican controlled state houses, which we've seen a lot of over the last 10 years, but especially in this moment in time now. I would say before we kind of transition our minds to thinking about what do we do if something doesn't happen, I think there's a lot of room to still be making a political case heading into 2022. I mean, my day job is to make a polling and data-driven case around kind of the Latino electorate specifically. Obviously, this electorate or the impacted population here is more than Latinos, but because Latinos are, impacted in an outsized way on this issue, I think there is a lot we can do to be making, one, an economic case for essential workers and farm workers in this moment in time, and kind of a broader legalization program. And two, I think there is a political case, as I said earlier, around the cost of inaction. Latinos in particular, and some recent polling that I've seen that we'll be releasing soon, in some ways hold Democrats to a higher standard and a higher level. Not to start where you were, like our friends, we hold them to higher standards than we do, because we believe we help put them there, and we believe that, because of that, we should have those higher expectations. So there will be a cost to inaction, and I think that is really critical for us to kind of convey and ensure that people, especially in Congress, feel, because ultimately, this action has to move forward in Congress. There's work that the Biden administration can do to communicate its support for key policies to Congress to keep them moving forward in a more positive direction. But ultimately, people who are in Congress need to feel like there will be a cost if they don't vote a particular way. And so I think there's a lot of work we can do to continue to communicate the role and of people who care about this issue in critical states where people are, and ensure that we're making that data-driven case about where they kind of stand and what they expect.
Okay, thank you so very much for that, Stephanie. I want to make sure we have time at the end to do a quick round of where do we go from here? And as King asked us so many years and decades ago. So let me just go quickly to the next question because I'm combining questions here. But, we've seen positions that people who are part of our movement have been placed in, and they're, these higher level positions within the administration. But then looking at some of these positions that may not be the kind you trumpet about, but still are important. And so getting questions about like the judges in immigration court and how even with this administration, we still have a large percentage being folks who were ICE and DHS attorneys. There was a lot made of the fact that there were public defenders that were placed on the bench on the not, the criminal court side. And, how do we get more of us into those positions on the immigration side and those other spaces, right? Where it may not be the director of this and the vice president of that, but that we still need to be in. And so any comments that any of you have about how we make that kind of push for those type of spaces and positions?
I would just add, I would say that, this is very similar around criminal justice. For example, on the side of like, okay, so we're ending private prisons, but we're not going to end private detention centers. And so I think that we have to make sure that we're looking at all the areas that touch the lives of our community. So certainly the immigration courts are critical. It really makes a difference who's going to make that final determination when you're presenting your case. So I think that we have to have a very robust and complex advocacy agenda that doesn't just look at the legislative push, but administrative, judicial, et cetera. And then to the earlier point too, is just in terms of the path to citizenship goes through our backyards. And so we have to be building local power in order to pressure our elected officials on the ground at all levels of government to actually advance an agenda that is going to advance our rights, family unity, et cetera. And so I'm also, from the perspective, is that the organizing is happening on the ground, building constituency on the ground in order to really be effective at all levels of government, local, state, and federal. For our state, in the state of California, we're going to have to defend ourselves from a recall that's being propelled by clearly, specifically from folks who have said, they're anti a lot of the pro-immigrant agenda changes that we've had in our state. So we have to be doing both at the same time.
Thank you, Angelica. So I apologize. We literally have 6 minutes left. I want to give folks a chance to talk about the way forward, beginning with you, Erica. But before I do so, just want to thank all of you who had questions. We have the questions. I'm not exactly sure how conference folks are working that, but if they send me the questions, I'll give you some comments on what I think about some of the questions that you've asked, and perhaps some of the other panelists can join me in doing that as well. But we definitely want to talk about the way forward in these last minutes that we have. And I'm sorry to constrain you to like a 2-minute space, but where do you see the next step, right? Because I think a lot of times, as Angelica pointed out, there's like the 10 steps from now, but you can't get there. You're not going to transport like on Star Trek, right? You've got to actually move in a certain direction to get there. And so what are the next steps that you see in terms of the way forward, Erica?
I think we have to make progress, and we have to see some wins before the end of the year. And we have to use every tool in the toolbox. And by that, as organizers in this panel, we know that there's many, many tools in the toolbox. It could be a direct call to your friend in the White House. It could be a letter. It could be direct action. It could be a sit-in. It could be a bus caravan to DC. We have to use whatever space we occupy in this ecosystem of a movement. We have to use all those tools to ensure that we're not leaving this year empty-handed. And by that, I mean, and I think Angelica said a little bit about this, is that, yes, Congress has the, in so many ways, the ultimate sort of relief, right? Which is like a path, maybe a path to citizenship, maybe changing the criminalization bills and so on and so forth. but also understanding that there's many other fixes and issues that can be fixed through the administration, and we have to go into every possibility of us making the progress that we need for our communities before the end of the year. And we can't stop pushing. No matter who's in the White House, we have to focus and keep our eyes on the prize, because people right now, as I said, are suffering.
Thank you so much, Erica. Angelica.
The first piece is I would be remiss if I wouldn't say that we want the administration and Congress to use the power they do have. They do have 50 votes in the Senate, and so use that. And so we're pushing to ensure that our issue of immigration is considered as part of the reconciliation. This is, we need changes now, and they've been needing for a long time. So for me, it's really important, again, to push our administration to use the power they have. Number two, we will celebrate. If at the end we only have a subset of folks who get immigration, that's certainly not where CHIRLA is. CHIRLA wants to make sure that as many people get legalization, and we reform our immigration system, and we actually stand in favor of family unity. That's where we want to be. We're going to celebrate for whoever's liberation is won. I want to make sure that we're clear that if we do not fix fundamentally this immigration system, and only think that legalization is the only thing we are fighting for, and not the fact that the system is closed off to people of color, to Latin American, Asian, and Black folks, that then we are making a huge mistake. And so I hope that we all stay committed for this transformation. And there was a question around outside, looking at immigration through a domestic lens and an international lens. I think it's really important that this country and all of us also commit to the investment of home countries, and really the democracy, advancing the democracy in many of these countries, and dealing with the violence that many times we're complicit in as a nation, that we deal with that in order for people to have a chance to also stay and have the right to stay in their country and not be forced to choose migration as the only option for survival.
Thank you so much, Angelica. Stephanie, you've got the last word.
Uh-oh, a lot of pressure. I'll keep mine to 3 points as well, which is one, use this moment to make an economic and a moral case, of course, but especially an economic case around the importance of doing this now, especially coming out of the pandemic and the role that essential workers, farm workers, undocumented workers played in this pandemic, and ensuring that our country survived this pandemic. We should legalize them. I think second is making the case around inaction. There will be a political cost for not acting on this issue. There's a lot of chatter around what happened with Latino voters, what will happen with Latino voters, should Democrats be worried in the future. I'm of the camp that I do not think that Latinos are automatically Democrats or should be automatically Democrats. Democrats have to fight for their votes, and part of immigration, fighting for immigration, is fighting for their vote. I have always viewed immigration as, and what we've seen in our research and our polling, as a threshold issue for Latinos. Oftentimes it is not the first or second issue that Latinos volunteer. They want a good job, they want a strong economy, they want to send their kids to good schools, but immigration is always one of those issues by which they judge candidates and measure whether candidates are for us or against us. Do they see us as net contributors in this economy, or do they see us as Donald Trump did, as murderers and rapists? And so the issue of immigration is a critical threshold issue, and there will be a cost for inaction. And the third piece I would just leave with is that, in some ways, even though it's a smaller set of kind of an impacted population, perhaps if you extrapolate the, number of undocumented people and their families, it really kind of ends up being the size and scope of the impact of what healthcare and the ACA was in 2009. There is a chance that there will be a short-term political cost here for some people on this issue and taking a hard vote. But I think longer term, when we look at some of the issues and the longer term trajectory of this issue, and acknowledging the role that immigrants have played in this country, that moving something forward this year will have long-term benefits. It may have some short-term impacts as well, but will ultimately have a long-term positive impact on the country by, pulling people out from the shadows and ensuring that we're acknowledging the role that immigrants play in this country. And so I think, again, making the case that there will be a cost for inaction, and that, this is what the country needs in this particular moment in time. This cannot be kicked down the road any longer.
Thank you again. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I hope you hear the virtual applause. Thank you, all of you, for your just spectacular descriptions and deep divings that you've done with us, guidings that you've done with us on this really important topic in this moment as we look at this administration's 100 days. Thank you again to Hiroshi. Thank you again to Ahilan for inviting me and inviting us to be a part of this conversation. I'm sure that folks are going to stick around so that they can hear that what's going to be a fabulous conversation with Senator Padilla. I certainly will be here. Thank you so very much. And I will pass it to you, Ahilan.
Thank you, Nana.
Yeah, let me just
Hiroshi will pick up first, right?
Oh yeah. So yeah, thank you, Nana, Erica, Angelica, Stephanie. I mean, this is such a rich conversation, and of course we're just getting started, which I guess fits the ambition of this conference to to start and continue these conversations. We get so many questions in the last 10 or 15 minutes, each of which we should have talked about for much longer. So Ahilan, you're going to jump in and just sort of explain how we're going to continue that part of the conversation, the Q&A.
Yeah, I think there's so many good questions coming at the end, and you all, that was amazing. It was an incredible discussion. I think what we're going to do is we'll take the questions out and put them on Twitter out of the CILP account with our CILP 100 hashtag, and we'll tag the panelists and Nana. And no pressure. I know you all are extremely busy, and we really are grateful for all the time you've already given us. But we'll just put them out there, over the next, today and in the time to come. People could feel free to engage on that on Twitter as much as they have the time for. So thank you all very, very much.
Okay. And so we hope to see everyone in about 30 minutes from now at 12 noon Pacific. So what we're going to do now is we're going to end the Zoom session. And so in that sense, bump you off, but please log back in on the same link for the conversation with Senator Padilla at noon Pacific. So we'll see you in a little bit under half an hour.